Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome back to our YouTube channel, Daily English Dialogues. We are absolutely thrilled to have you joining us for another installment of our Deep Dive series. If you are tuning in with the goal of sharpening your listening comprehension and expanding your professional vocabulary to a more sophisticated level, you have definitely come to the right place. I'm joined today by my good friend and longtime collaborator. How are you holding up today?
Thanks for the warm welcome. Honestly, I'm doing quite well, though I must admit I've had a rather whirlwind morning already. It's great to be back in the studio. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that is universally applicable, something that everyone can relate to regardless of their geographical location or their specific career path, the typical workday. We aren't just talking about the tasks we do, but the entire experience surrounding them.
That's a great point. We want to peel back the layers of the professional experience. We'll be discussing everything from those initial morning rituals that set the tone for the day, all the way to the dreaded afternoon slump and the final commute home. Our goal today is to move beyond the basic, "I go to work at 9" sentences, and really explore the nuances of professional life.
Exactly. To help our listeners reach that upper intermediate and advanced threshold, we'll be weaving in B2 level expressions and idiomatic phrases. These are the kinds of words that help you sound more natural and persuasive in a business environment. Instead of just saying a task is hard, we might talk about it being labor-intensive or taxing.
Right. And instead of saying we are busy, we might describe ourselves as being snowed under or swamped. It's these subtle shifts in vocabulary that really demonstrate a high level of fluency. We want to provide our audience with a toolkit of phrases they can take directly into their next meeting or job interview.
I think it's also important to mention that we'll be keeping the tone conversational. Even though the vocabulary is advanced, the way we speak to each other is how colleagues might chat over a coffee break. It's that balance of professional terminology and a friendly, accessible delivery that makes Daily English Dialogues what it is.
Well said. I think our listeners appreciate the authenticity. We aren't reading from a dry textbook. We're reflecting on real-life experiences. So, whether you're listening while commuting, doing chores, or sitting at your desk during your own lunch break, we invite you to settle in.
Grab a notebook if you want to jot down some of these new expressions, or just sit back and let the language wash over you. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to the modern workday, especially with how much the landscape has shifted recently, with remote and hybrid work.
That's a very relevant angle. The workday doesn't look the same for everyone anymore. But before we get ahead of ourselves and start debating the merits of home offices versus corporate cubicles, let's go back to the very beginning of the day.
Sounds like a plan. I'm ready when you are. Let's break down the anatomy of a workday.
So let's start at the very beginning of the cycle. I'm curious, are you naturally an early bird, or do you find it an uphill battle to get into gear when the alarm goes off?
To be perfectly honest, I've had to consciously cultivate the habit of being an early riser. It certainly didn't come naturally to me. In my university days, I was much more of a night owl. However, I eventually realized that if I wanted to stay on top of my workload, I needed to get a head start. I usually set my alarm for 6:30 a.m. to ensure I have a substantial buffer period before I even think about my commute. There's nothing more detrimental to my mood than feeling rushed and frantic before the day has even officially begun.
I completely sympathize with that. That feeling of being on the back foot from the moment you step out of bed can be incredibly draining. It creates a sort of snowball effect of stress that follows you into the office. For me, interestingly enough, the morning commute has evolved into a bit of a sanctuary. I take the train, which grants me about 45 minutes of uninterrupted time. It's a rare window where nobody can tap me on the shoulder or ask for a quick favor.
That's a luxury, really. Having that transition period is vital. How do you usually utilize that time? Are you scrolling through social media, or is it more intentional?
I try to avoid social media because it can be so overstimulating. Instead, I use that time to ease into the day. I might listen to a podcast about industry trends or perhaps some instrumental music to sharpen my focus. It helps me mentally bridge the gap between my domestic life and my professional persona. By the time the train pulls into the station, I feel like I've already done the mental heavy lifting.
My experience is a bit more taxing, unfortunately. My commute involves a 40-minute drive through some pretty congested areas. If there's an accident or roadwork, my stress levels can skyrocket. I've had to learn how to mitigate that frustration. I've become quite fond of audiobooks and language learning apps. It turns what would be dead time into something intellectually stimulating. I like to think of my car as a mobile classroom.
Mobile classroom. I love that expression. It's all about maximizing efficiency and reclaiming your time.
But tell me, do you find that your commute ever bleeds into your actual work hours? For instance, are you checking notifications at red lights?
I'm trying to break that habit, but it's tempting. There is this societal pressure to be constantly reachable, but it's a recipe for burnout. I've realized that the world won't end if I don't see an email the second it's sent. However, once I actually pull into the parking lot and walk through those front doors, my mindset shifts immediately. The first order of business is always the same: head straight to the coffee machine.
Ah, the ritualistic caffeine fix. For many of us, the workday doesn't truly commence until that first sip of coffee. It's almost like a psychological on switch.
Exactly. And while I'm waiting for the machine to brew, I usually have those brief water cooler chats with colleagues. It's just small talk, asking about the weekend or complaining about the traffic, but it builds a sense of camaraderie. It's that social grease that makes the gears of the office turn more smoothly.
That's a great way to put it. Even for those of us who work remotely a few days a week, we miss those spontaneous interactions. There's a certain energy in a physical workspace that's hard to replicate over a video call. But once the coffee is in hand and you're finally sitting at your desk, that's when the real challenge begins, facing the digital mountain of the inbox.
Oh, don't remind me. The transition from the calm of the commute to the chaos of a cluttered inbox can be quite a jolt to the system. But I suppose that's the price we pay for a productive career.
Indeed it is. And that leads us perfectly into how we actually manage the workload once the early bird phase ends and the grind begins. So, we've made it to the desk, the coffee is steaming, and you finally log in. Then it happens, the inbox avalanche. For many, this is the most daunting moment of the day. How do you personally navigate that initial wave of information without letting it derail your entire morning?
It's a formidable challenge, honestly. If I'm not careful, I can spend 3 hours just reacting to other people's agendas instead of advancing my own. I've had to implement a very rigorous system to maintain my sanity. I generally start with a triage approach, much like a doctor in an emergency room. I scan the subject lines to identify anything that is truly time-sensitive or mission-critical.
Triage. That's a sophisticated word to use in a business context. It implies a high level of organization. I take a similar path, but I try to adhere to the 2-minute rule. If an inquiry requires a simple yes or a quick confirmation, I deal with it instantaneously. If it's a multifaceted request that requires research or deep thought, I move it to a dedicated folder. I find that if I don't clear the deck of the small stuff, they clutter my mental space.
I see the merit in that, but I've actually moved away from checking email first thing. I've started experimenting with deep work blocks. I'll spend the first 90 minutes of my day working on my most labor-intensive project, the one that requires maximum cognitive output, before I even open my mail client. I've found that my willpower and focus are finite resources, and they are at their peak right after I arrive.
That requires a tremendous amount of discipline. Many of us feel an almost addictive urge to check for notifications. We're afraid of missing out on something urgent. But you're right, proactive work is almost always more valuable than reactive work. When you finally do open that inbox, how do you handle the noise, the CC'd emails you didn't really need to see, or the general office announcements?
I've become quite ruthless with filters and unsubscribing. If a thread doesn't require my direct input, I archive it. I also try to discourage reply all chains whenever possible. It's about protecting my attention. Once the inbox is somewhat under control, I move to my master to-do list. I rank my tasks using the Eisenhower matrix, categorizing things by urgent and important versus not urgent but important.
The Eisenhower matrix is a classic for a reason. It forces you to acknowledge that just because something is urgent, like a ringing phone or a pinging chat, it doesn't mean it's important for your long-term goals. I often find that the not urgent but important category, like strategic planning or professional development, is what gets pushed aside if we aren't intentional.
Precisely. And that's where eating the frog comes back into play. If I have a difficult conversation to have or a complex report to draft, I force myself to do it before lunch. If I leave it for the afternoon, the procrastination monkey starts whispering in my ear, telling me I can just do it tomorrow.
The procrastination monkey is a very relatable image. It's that internal voice that prefers the easy, low-stakes tasks over the ones that actually move the needle. I've also noticed that setting micro deadlines for myself helps. Instead of saying, I will work on this report today, I say, I will finish the introduction by 10:30 a.m. It creates a sense of momentum.
Momentum is key.
Once you've checked off 2 or 3 significant items, you feel a sense of accomplishment that carries you through the rest of the day. It's that psychological win that makes the more tedious parts of the job, like the inevitable meetings we're about to discuss, much more bearable.
Absolutely. You've conquered the inbox, you've prioritized your big rocks, and you've managed to avoid the lure of the quick check of the news. You feel like a productivity ninja. But then, the calendar notification pops up. Team Sync Meeting, Room 4B.
And just like that, the deep work sanctuary is breached. It's time to shift from solo productivity to collective collaboration. Let's see if we can maintain that efficiency in a group setting.
And just like that, the deep work sanctuary is breached. The calendar notification pings, and it's time to shift gears from solo productivity to collective collaboration. I'm curious, do you view meetings as a necessary evil, or do you actually find value in these group huddles?
It's a polarizing topic, isn't it? If I'm being perfectly candid, I think the modern workplace is plagued by meeting fatigue. There's a tendency to call a meeting for things that could have been resolved with a well-crafted email. However, when we are tackling a multifaceted problem that requires cross-departmental input, there's no substitute for real-time dialogue. It's about the synergy that happens when different perspectives clash and combine.
Synergy. That's a classic corporate buzzword, but it actually carries a lot of weight when the team is firing on all cylinders. I've noticed that the most effective meetings I attend always have a strict agenda-first policy. If there's no clear outline of what we're trying to achieve, we inevitably end up going down a rabbit hole discussing minor details that aren't relevant to the bigger picture.
Oh, the rabbit holes are the worst. You start off discussing budget allocations and somehow end up debating the color of the office kitchen tiles. It's a massive drain on company resources. That's why I've become a huge advocate for the facilitator role, someone whose sole job is to keep the conversation on track and rein in anyone who starts to veer off topic.
That's a vital role. But even in a well-run meeting, there's often an undercurrent of office politics at play. Have you ever felt that what's being said on the surface isn't the whole story? Sometimes there's a lot of reading between the lines required to understand the true dynamics of the room.
Absolutely. Navigating the social landscape of an office is like playing a high-stakes game of chess. You have to be aware of who has the ear of the management, who is competing for the same promotion, and who is simply trying to pass the buck when a project goes south. It's not just about your technical skills. Your soft skills and emotional intelligence are what truly allow you to thrive in a corporate environment.
Pass the buck. That's a great idiom for our listeners. It means to shift the responsibility or blame to someone else. I found that the best way to handle office politics is to remain professionally neutral. I try to stay out of the gossip and focus on delivering high-quality work. If you provide value consistently, you become indispensable, which is the best defense against any political maneuvering.
That's a very grounded philosophy. However, collaboration isn't all about defense and politics. It's also about building bridges. I really enjoy those brainstorming sessions where no idea is considered too out there. It's a chance to be creative and step outside the rigid confines of our daily job descriptions. When a team is truly in sync, the sense of accomplishment is much greater than anything you could achieve alone.
I agree. There's a certain buzz in the air when a project finally starts to gain traction because everyone is pulling in the same direction. It reminds me that, despite the occasional tedious meeting, we are part of something larger. But man, after 90 minutes of high-level strategizing and navigating social cues, I'm usually completely wiped out.
Tell me about it. Mental exhaustion is just as real as physical fatigue. By the time the meeting wraps up, my stomach is usually growling and my brain is screaming for a change of scenery. Which brings us to perhaps the most anticipated part of the workday, the midday break.
I think we've earned it. Let's step away from the conference table and talk about how to properly refuel. Now, be honest, do you actually clock out for lunch, or are you a frequent practitioner of the working lunch, where you're juggling a fork in one hand and a mouse in the other?
I'll be the first to admit that I've fallen into the desk lunch trap more times than I care to count. There's this pervasive myth in corporate culture that staying glued to your seat makes you look more dedicated. But in reality, it's a one-way ticket to burnout city. I've had to make a concerted effort to physically remove myself from my workstation. Even if it's just for 20 minutes, that change of environment is non-negotiable for my mental well-being.
It's so true. The cognitive load of staying in the same environment where you tackle stress is immense. I've read studies suggesting that our brains aren't designed for 8 hours of linear focus. We need these interstitial spaces, little gaps in the day to process information. I've actually started a habit of digital fasting during my lunch hour. No phone, no emails, just the food, and perhaps a conversation with a colleague about anything except work.
Digital fasting. I love that term. It's so easy to replace one screen with another, isn't it? You close your laptop only to spend 30 minutes scrolling through your phone. That's not a break, that's just a different type of eye strain. Lately, I've been trying to incorporate a post-lunch stroll. Getting some vitamin D and moving my legs helps to counteract the sedentary nature of office life. It gets the blood flowing back to the brain.
Exactly. And it's often during those walks that I have my most serendipitous ideas. When you stop trying to solve a problem and just let your mind wander, the subconscious takes over. I've had light bulb moments regarding complex spreadsheets while just staring at a tree in the park. If you keep the engine running at high RPMs all day, eventually it's going to overheat.
That's a perfect metaphor. We have to treat ourselves like high-performance machines. You wouldn't expect a car to run forever without a pit stop, right? I also find that what you eat plays a massive role. If I opt for a heavy, carb-loaded meal, I can practically feel the food coma setting in by 2 p.m. I try to stick to something light and protein-rich to sustain my energy levels for the second half of the day.
Ah, the food coma. The technical term being postprandial somnolence for those of our listeners who want to get really advanced. It's that sluggish feeling where your eyelids start to feel like lead weights. I've learned that lesson the hard way after too many pasta lunches. Now I try to view food as fuel rather than just a distraction.
It's all part of a holistic approach to the workday. It's about pacing yourself. If you sprint through the morning and neglect your midday recharge, you're going to hit a wall. And hitting that wall is especially dangerous because it usually coincides with the most difficult part of the day to stay motivated.
You're talking about the slump, aren't you? That mid-afternoon period where the clock seems to slow down and your productivity takes a nosedive.
Precisely. You've refueled, you've had your walk, but the biological clock has other plans. Let's talk about how to survive that inevitable dip in energy.
Precisely. You've refueled, you've had your walk, but the biological clock has other plans. Let's talk about how to survive that inevitable dip in energy. For most people, it hits somewhere between 2:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. I call it the circadian sinkhole. How do you keep your head above water when your brain starts to feel like it's wrapped in cotton wool?
Circadian sinkhole. That's incredibly accurate. It's that bizarre phenomenon where you're staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes and none of the words are registering. My primary strategy is task switching. I've realized that trying to force my way through a complex analytical task during the slump is an exercise in futility. Instead, I pivot to low-stakes activities. I might organize my digital files, update my calendar, or do some light proofreading. It allows me to stay productive without requiring a high level of intellectual horsepower.
That's a very pragmatic approach. I take a similar route. I find that the afternoon slump is actually a great time for housekeeping tasks. I'll clear out my physical desk, shred old documents, or respond to those non-urgent FYI-style messages that have been lingering in my inbox. There's something quite satisfying about crossing small things off a list when you don't have the capacity for big-picture thinking.
It's all about working with your biology rather than against it. I also find that sensory shifts can help. If I'm feeling particularly drowsy, I'll switch from my desk to a standing desk, or even just move to a different chair in a common area. Sometimes simply changing your physical perspective can trick your brain into a state of higher alertness. And of course, there's the controversial afternoon caffeine hit. Where do you stand on the late-day espresso?
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? While a quick shot of caffeine can provide that much-needed jolt to the system, it can also play havoc with your sleep cycle later that night. I try to stick to herbal tea or a very large glass of ice-cold water. Dehydration is often a silent contributor to fatigue, and we frequently mistake thirst for tiredness. If I really need a pick-me-up, I'll opt for a high-protein snack, like a handful of almonds, to keep my blood sugar stable.
Good call. Avoiding the vending machine's sugar rush is crucial. You might feel great for 15 minutes after a candy bar, but the subsequent sugar crash will leave you feeling worse than before. Another tactic I found effective is social stimulation. If I'm hitting a wall, I'll walk over to a colleague's desk to discuss a project in person. That brief human interaction usually provides enough of a dopamine boost to carry me through the next hour.
That's a great tip. We are social creatures after all. But what happens when the slump is interrupted by an urgent request? Sometimes, just when you're at your lowest energy point, a high-priority task lands on your desk with a deadline of yesterday.
That is the ultimate test of professional resilience. It's like being asked to run a sprint at the end of a marathon. You have to find that second wind and dig deep. But navigating those high-pressure moments is a skill in itself.
It certainly is.
It's one thing to manage a slow afternoon, but it's quite another to stay composed when the pressure starts to mount and the clock is working against you.
Which brings us to the high-stakes environment of deadlines and performing under duress. Let's look at how we handle the crunch time.
It certainly is. It's one thing to manage a slow afternoon, but it's quite another to stay composed when the pressure starts to mount and the clock is working against you. When you're up against it, do you find that the adrenaline helps you focus, or do you tend to feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of work?
It's a bit of a catch-22. In small doses, that fight-or-flight response can actually sharpen my focus and help me enter a state of flow where I'm incredibly efficient. But if the pressure is sustained for too long, it becomes counterproductive. I start making silly mistakes, typos, logical fallacies, or forgetting to attach files. To prevent that, I've learned to compartmentalize. I look at the massive project and I mentally block out everything except the immediate next step.
I love that term, compartmentalize. It's a vital survival mechanism in a fast-paced environment. I often use the Pomodoro technique when I'm under the gun. I'll set a timer for 25 minutes of absolute laser-focused work, followed by a 5-minute brain break. It prevents that feeling of drowning in the workload. Even if the deadline is looming, those 5 minutes of stepping back allow me to maintain my perspective.
That's a very disciplined approach. I also think expectation management is a key part of staying under pressure. If a client or a manager drops a bombshell request on my desk at 4 p.m., I don't just say yes blindly. I'll say, I can certainly prioritize this, but it means the other report will have to be pushed to tomorrow morning. Is that an acceptable trade-off? It's about being assertive rather than just being a yes man.
Exactly. Being a yes man is a fast track to burnout, and frankly, it often results in subpar work. People respect you more when you provide a realistic time frame. However, we've all had those all-hands-on-deck moments where there is no room for negotiation. The product launches tomorrow, or the legal filing is due by midnight. In those scenarios, how do you keep the team's morale from tanking?
In those crunch time periods, communication becomes even more critical. You have to be transparent about the challenges, but remain optimistic about the outcome. I try to inject a little bit of gallows humor to lighten the mood. If we can laugh together about how absurd the situation is, it creates a sense of camaraderie that makes the long hours more bearable. We're all in the same boat after all.
Gallows humor. That's such a descriptive phrase for finding irony in a stressful situation. It really does help to diffuse the tension. I also find that micro wins are important during a high-pressure stretch. When we finish a difficult section of a presentation, we take a 30-second victory lap to acknowledge the progress. It keeps the momentum from stagnating.
Resilience is essentially a muscle that you build over time. The more deadlines you navigate successfully, the more confidence you have in your ability to handle the next one. You start to realize that while the pressure is intense, it's also temporary. There is always a light at the end of the tunnel.
And that light, of course, is the moment you finally hit send or submit and realize the day is finally drawing to a close. But the transition from high-octane work mode back to civilian life can be surprisingly difficult.
It really is. You can't just flip a switch and be relaxed the moment you walk out the door. Your brain is still revving like a car engine.
Which is exactly why the final stage of the workday, the shutdown ritual, is perhaps the most important one for our long-term health. Let's talk about how to effectively leave work at work. When the clock finally strikes 5 or 6, do you have a specific routine to unplug, or do you find your mind wandering back to your spreadsheets while you're trying to cook dinner?
It's a constant struggle, to be perfectly honest. In our hyper-connected world, the boundary between our professional and private lives has become increasingly blurred. With work emails accessible on our phones, the temptation to just check one more thing is immense. I've had to implement what I call a hard shutdown. Before I leave my desk, I spend 10 minutes writing down the top 3 priorities for tomorrow. It's a way of downloading my thoughts onto paper, so my brain doesn't feel the need to keep processing them all evening.
That's a brilliant psychological trick. By externalizing those tasks, you're giving your mind permission to stop worrying about them. I do something similar, which I call the commute decompression. If I'm driving or taking the train, I use that time to transition. I'll listen to something completely unrelated to my field, maybe a comedy podcast or some upbeat music. By the time I turn my house key in the lock, I've mentally shed the skin of my professional persona.
Shedding your skin, I like that imagery. It's about identity.
We are more than just our job titles, but it's easy to forget that when we're snowed under with responsibilities. I've also become very strict about digital boundaries. I've disabled work notifications on my phone after 7 p.m. If something is truly a catastrophe, people have my number and can call, but 99% of the time, that urgent email can wait until 9 a.m. the next day.
Setting those boundaries is an act of self-preservation. If you're always on, you're never truly present for your family, your friends, or even yourself. I've noticed that since I've started being more protective of my evening time, my output during the day has actually improved. I'm more refreshed, and I have more bandwidth to handle challenges because I've actually allowed my battery to recharge.
Exactly. It's the quality over quantity argument. Working 14 hours a day at 50% capacity is far less effective than working 8 hours at 100%. I also think having a hobby that is completely physical helps. For me, it's weightlifting or gardening. These activities require me to be in the moment and use my body rather than just my brain. It's the ultimate antidote to a day spent staring at a glowing screen.
I couldn't agree more. Whether it's yoga, painting, or just taking the dog for a walk, we need that tactile connection to the world. Well, we've certainly covered the entire spectrum of the workday today, from the early morning alarm to the final evening wind-down. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I hope for our listeners at Daily English Dialogues, this conversation has provided not just new vocabulary, but perhaps a bit of solace in knowing that we all face these same daily hurdles. Professional life is a marathon, and learning how to pace yourself is the secret to a long and fulfilling career.
Beautifully said. Thank you all so much for tuning in and spending your valuable time with us. If you found this episode helpful, please do hit the like button and share it with a colleague who might be struggling with their own afternoon slump.
Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is your non-negotiable after-work ritual? Until next time, stay productive, but more importantly, stay balanced.
Goodbye, everyone, and see you in the next dialogue.